Welcome to the Wellness Revolution podcast, the radio show all about wellness in your mind, body, spirit, personal growth, sex, and relationships. Stay tuned for weekly interviews featuring guests that have achieved physical, mental, and spiritual health in their lives. If you'd like to have access to our entire back catalog, visit drveronica.com for instant access. And here is your host, Dr. Veronica.
Another episode of the Wellness Revolution. You know me, I'm Dr. Veronica, and I want to introduce to you a wonderful woman today, and we're going to talk about healing emotional trauma. Now, let me just give you a little bit of background. When I was an eye surgeon, and yes, you know, I started my life as an eye surgeon, I got to a point in my practice where I felt that every other person had been sexually abused. Now, there's something about me where people are just feel confident in telling me some of their deep secrets. So I'm doing eye exams and chatting with people, and I would find out just all types of information about their life. So sexual abuse is one of those issues I heard about time and time again, and I just started to get really paranoid about it. I started to ask, have I been sexually abused? No, I have not been sexually abused. And I feel blessed that that is the case. But a lot of people have, and a lot of people have gone through it, but a lot of people are struggling with it still and have had health issues, physical health issues, as a result of this emotional trauma that happened long ago. So today we're going to talk about this really delicate subject, because in order to get rid of the spiritual legacy of sexual abuse or any type of trauma and abuse, you have to talk about it. You have to bring it to life, because the truth heals. Your voice about this heals. So I would like to introduce to you Niki Gratrix. I don't know if I'm getting that pronunciation right, but Niki Gratrix. From the UK, but now living in California. She's what I'll call one of my soul sisters, doing intuitive work, but also a nutritionist, does sort of the standard stuff that you guys can grasp on really easily. But I'm telling you, where we all get these real results in helping people is not just putting the spiritual part together, but not just putting the physical part together, but putting them both together and helping people see more clearly. So here I am, eye surgeon originally. I used to operate on people's eyes under a microscope. Now, as a clairvoyant eye surgeon, I help people see clearly. So here's another woman I introduced you. Niki, welcome to the Wellness Revolution.
Thank you so much for having me. And wow, what a stunning story that you have. It speaks volumes. It's so symbolic of some of the things we're going to talk about as well. So it's such an important topic, talking about emotional trauma and adversity in childhood and how that's so connected to what happens to us health-wise in adulthood.
So first, I want you to just give us a little bit of your, let's say, the background that people like to grasp onto. Every time I do my interview, my fax machine rings. So you guys are used to listening to this. But anyway, Niki, a little bit about your background.
Yes, so I actually, originally I co-founded a large clinic in London in the UK, and I trained as a clinical nutritionist. I'd actually had a career in banking and finance before that in London. It was totally unrelated, and then I realised I was totally in the wrong career. Retrained as a clinical nutritionist. At the time, my business partner and life partner had been very sick with chronic fatigue for 7 years. He'd just recovered. We met, and we both realized, A, we wanted to start a clinic together, and B, with the sort of the illness that is, it's that illness range of like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, kind of burnout, adrenal fatigue, that entire spectrum of illnesses. We wanted to specialize in that, but we realized right from the beginning, we needed a psychology division and we needed a nutrition division, because just doing physical stuff, whether that was functional medicine, functional nutrition, all the things that I took care of, it wasn't going to be enough to address this kind of illness related to chronic fatigue. So I kind of got a bit of a baptism of fire, where I saw how what goes on emotionally, how people feel psychologically, directly feeds into their physical expression as well. So I got to kind of study it up front for 5 years. We became a very big clinic. We had patients in 35 different countries, and we even got published a pilot study in the British Medical Journal Open, because we had so many clients and so on. And I know at the time we were actually filling a hole in the UK at the time. There was a lot of suffering going on with that illness, and a lot of unmet needs, conventional medicine having no clue, not taking a systems biology approach, like the functional side of things, and totally ignoring, potentially the psychology side, basically telling people they were making it up. So it was after that I then spread my awareness outside of just chronic fatigue, and I really started to study the research behind psychoneuroimmunology and the link between emotional well-being and physical well-being, and how actually what happens in childhood has so much impact. It's the most underexposed risk factor of all chronic complex illness today. And so, the type of work that you do, Dr. Veronica, I just want to say it's so important. And we can perhaps get into some, I'll share some of the statistics around probably what people don't realize, how important it is to address and look at the subjective state of the patient, your internal state, and who you've been as a person, who you are in the world, why you do the things that you do. And if we don't explore that, it's missing half the picture. So that was how my background got into this subject anyway. So chronic fatigue syndrome is like I call it the poster child of looking at adversity in childhood, because if you have adverse childhood events, you have a 600% increased risk of chronic fatigue syndrome in adulthood, and that's in PubMed studies.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
It's so huge.
Yes, it's the highest risk of all of them. And I'll sort of pass back to you in a second, but I can actually go into more details and show you and explain to you what are the risk factors for different types of chronic complex illness if you have adversity in childhood. And we can define what we mean by adversity as well.
Yes. But let me just ask about another common disease state that people have, fibromyalgia. What's going on with fibromyalgia?
It's so much related to unresolved emotional trauma. 60% of women with fibromyalgia report sexual abuse in childhood. So it doesn't have to just be sexual abuse. That the kind of adversity that is going to affect our epigenetic expression can come from a whole range of different things, but definitely a large proportion of that is emotional abuse. It can be physical abuse. It could be parents separating or divorce. But with fibromyalgia, it is literally 60% of the women who've been assessed, and more women get fibromyalgia than men, happen to report sexual abuse. And if you like, you could almost see intuitively and emotionally speaking, fibromyalgia, it's like stuffed energy. It's stuffed, unresolved, unfaced emotional trauma, which is emotional pain expressing as physical pain, because the body is just is kind of like a hologram, and it's almost mirroring what's going on emotionally at the subconscious level. So it's another one. I call it the poster child illness for unresolved emotional trauma. And
let's talk about
should look at it.
The big C, cancer. Cancer is one of those ones. And when we talk about this, I want the audience to understand that we're not blaming the victim at all. This is about understanding the genesis and how diseases get turned on and off, how emotional states turn on and off. And so what it means is if it got turned on, there's a way to turn it off. But first you have to understand the triggers. So let's talk about cancer, because people just feel that I have cancer because I have a rare gene, or I'd have breasts or ovaries, or I was exposed to this toxin that was physical. I got mesothelioma because I was exposed to asbestos, or I have the BRCA gene, so I have cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer. Address trauma and emotional states in regard to cancer.
Yes, so this one is, it's another big link between emotional trauma in childhood and it can happen in adulthood. Emotional trauma is a contributing factor. And normally you're going to see all of these things, like there usually has to be present a toxin. And if there is emotional trauma present as well, then you're kind of getting the recipe for a much increased propensity to develop cancer. So for example, we have cancer cells that develop in the body all the time because we're faced with toxins, but the body has a way of dealing with that. So there are repair mechanisms. The body has its own repair mechanisms and things like apoptosis to kill off cells that have become infected and so on. So it's usually the DNA and the cancer can be triggered by a toxin, but what switches off the body's ability to repair that is emotional trauma, unresolved emotional trauma, because it actually changes the epigenetic expression of our stress response and this thing called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which will actually modulate how the body responds to repairs and renews cells. So you see, when you get both, you get the toxin that's creating, DNA mutation, and then you switch off the body's natural repair mechanisms, and you develop the cancer. So, and also in terms of like prevalence, it's been so underexposed about emotional trauma and the psychological aspects which contribute to it. And we're talking about unconscious trauma, that usually trauma means the person's become disconnected, disassociated from the trauma. So you could never say it's somebody's fault, that they've got some psychological thing and they've caused their own cancer. It's happening at an unconscious level. It usually happens at a young age, and it actually changes the way that our genes are expressing. So when we have a trauma in childhood, for example, the body does not heal, it conceals, and time doesn't heal, it conceals. And I will share one of the studies. There was a major studies that started by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in the mid-1990s, where they were literally looking at masses of numbers of people, like 17,500 people responded to a survey, where they measured adverse childhood events in childhood, the number of them that they'd had, and then they correlated it with risk onset of diseases in adulthood. And essentially they found that you have a massive increased risk of 7 out of the top 10 causes of death if you have adversity in childhood. Yeah, and speaking specifically to cancer, for example, if you had just 4 adverse childhood events, they defined 10 for this purposes of the study. If you had 4, for example, you had 2.5 times the risk of cancer in adulthood. If you had 8 ACEs, adverse childhood events, we abbreviate adverse childhood events as ACEs. If you had 8 of them, you had a threefold increased risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of heart disease as well, by the way, So other statistics around 4 ACEs, just for other types of illnesses, so people have, can compare. Risk of adult onset depression, 4.5 times higher. Diabetes, 1.6 times higher. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder is 2.5 times higher. As I mentioned, 6-fold increase of chronic fatigue syndrome. If you had just 2 ACEs, you have a 70 to 100% increased risk of autoimmunity in adulthood. And Alzheimer's with 4 ACEs is a 400% increased risk. So, this is data. When the researchers did this original research and they found these unbelievable statistics, it triggered off a whole set of later studies that have become the ACEs studies. And the researchers actually, they interviewed the researchers cried when they saw the results, because they realized they'd uncovered a hidden crisis and an epidemic. And that's where we are. And this is why I talk about ACEs as much as I can to get the message out there.
Wow. So these adverse child events, one that you mentioned, autoimmune disease. What about, break it out a little bit more? One of the common autoimmune diseases that a lot of us see are thyroid problems, especially Hashimoto's. Is there any statistics on that in adverse childhood events?
Absolutely. So, for example, that you have, for example, there's things like Th1 dominant autoimmune conditions. That's like type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and so on. You have a 70% increased risk with 2 ACEs. For Th2 dominant autoimmune conditions, that's more on the thyroiditis, I believe, and that type of thing. It's 100% increased risk. So, the correlation of autoimmune onset in adulthood for women and ACEs is strongly linked to smoking and lung cancer. People don't know that's a real statistic. And, the statistics also show, as women, we are at increased risk of abuse in childhood. So we're more likely to be abused in childhood. And it's interesting to wonder if there's a correlation between these autoimmune diseases and fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome that are female dominant illnesses, like 2/3 to 3/4 of people are women with those illnesses. So yeah, it's the last undiscovered country, our internal subjective sort of state and what's going on with this emotionally is translated, our childhood biography becomes our adult biology.
So let's just switch a little bit. We have these adverse childhood events, and if we move it over a little bit to, not a little bit, but a lot, towards the spiritual realm, and it depends on how people feel about their spiritual life and whether it exists and what's right and what's wrong. So I'm going into territory that some of you may say, oh, whoa, don't go there. And I don't believe like that. But for me as a medical intuitive and a seer, I can see information in past lives and between lives. And so I'm not talking about what has happened here. And a lot of times there have been agreements made for some of these events to happen. How do you take into account information like that? Do you believe that? Do you ever talk to people about that? People could say, well, how could I agree to be an abused child? How could I agree to that?
Yes.
Or how could I agree to be an abuser? Because there's agreements on both sides. We all have our soul groups. People think of soulmates as this some person you're really in love with, but you have a group of people that, or souls that you travel lives through to learn particular lessons. And so your illnesses and your injuries are part of how you really learn lessons. They really can help you leap forward. And so some of these traumas, really, I know a lot of people who have had major trauma in their life, and they're doing wonderful, wonderful things to benefit the world. So talk to people a little bit about some of those soul agreements. They may have never heard this before. We're in that uncharted territory that a lot of people like to say, wait a minute, I don't believe in that. It's here and now and that's it. But keep listening. Go ahead, Niki.
So it's very interesting because I often talk about the kind of intergenerationally inherited trauma, and that is actually, I'm using that technical term, but actually I'm talking about that is past lives. So we're reincarnating into our ancestral bloodlines. So and we know that even the science shows that actually it's totally a real thing. And for example, 3rd generation survivors of the Holocaust victims have the same physiological and psychological expression as their grandparents who were in the Holocaust. So wow. we know that trauma is inherited. And I have many patients, for example, when I was working with fibromyalgia patients who they had the same trauma expression and took on the same illness as their mother. And they say to me, but why did I do that? Why would I do that? And I usually, it's this intuitive empath types, the helper types, that they're usually women, and they're caring and they're loving, and they take it on to heal it because they love the mother. They love the people, their family, and so they take it into their own body to heal it for the family member. So and this is the thing about being a loving human being. There's a whole subset of patients that actually take on these illnesses in their own body to heal it for the family that they love, for example. And I think also in terms of past life, certainly events that happen to us, the trauma from previous lives, most certainly can stay in our own energy field and then cause epigenetic changes in this physical lifetime that would lead on to illnesses. Because I say all the time to people I get people to look at adversity in childhood and, look into it. Did anything happen? And they'll sometimes come back to me and say, no, I had a great child. There's nothing there. And then I say to them, okay, what about your parents or grandparents? Or anybody who was in a war? I mean, how many of our relatives have been in war or famine situations as well? And that's also been proven it goes down more than 2 or 3 generations, the impact of that biologically. So, and essentially,
well, I'm going to say they talk about, there's a verse in the Bible about curses going to the 7th generation. And you look at that and you read, well, what does that mean? Curses go to the 7th generation. And I started looking at, I feel like I'm very blessed in that I had a wonderful childhood. And as far as I know, there hasn't been any abuse or anything like that. And I think that's probably why relatively I'm so physically healthy. However, when I look at some of the issues in my extended family, and I'm not saying I'm immune to all these different things. I see promiscuity, I see violence, I see sexual abuse, there seems to be a conspiracy of silence about it, that nobody wants to really talk about it and address it. And so it continues to go on, and people act like it's just not there. And so the people who have been the victims feel like they're the bad ones, and therefore it continues to go on and on and on because you don't break whatever.
Yes.
So
and that is so exactly, it's so tragic because it's like a double wounding, the original trauma and then the trauma of it being then concealed, if you like. So it's tremendously important. And I think there's nobody that's not affected by this. And the interesting thing is, this is kind of the most fascinating thing. Probably the majority of everybody who has some trauma that's maybe manifested into a physical illness in this lifetime, it's actually not theirs. It's not caused by this lifetime. So it's not only is the original trauma not theirs in the sense that it wasn't created in this lifetime, it may have been past life, or it was passed down from a family member and they took it into their body. So a lot of the time, that's another way of it. It's kind of not their trauma, but it's their responsibility. It becomes their responsibility to have to face up to it and do the healing. So they're like the designated healer, should they choose to be. But there's the other thing people don't realize is when you're healing a trauma, often they don't realize you're healing it for your entire genetic family. You're clearing the trauma for your entire ancestral lineage. So, that's an amazing thing, and people deserve a huge, sort of hug and love for taking on something like that.
So let's talk about that a little bit more, because people want to say, well, what do I do to get out of this situation? I mean, it's all over, it's all around me. What do you say? People are taking on healing. What are types of activities, rituals that people can do to actually start healing these spiritual, emotional issues that are causing these really deep-seated health problems?
So, right, step one has to be awareness. So step one is literally, some people may not have considered it before. Some people may have maybe vaguely thought, I wonder if this could be impacting me. So step one is literally explore. And that might mean taking an inventory of your own childhood adversity, and actually noting that down. Start to think about it. Talk to your parents if that's appropriate. Even extended family, about finding out. If you don't ask, you may never find out things that have happened that you would never have otherwise known if you didn't ask. Explore also is things like you could go and see a medical intuitive, for example, someone like yourself. You could go and do an energy scan and have an energetic scan done that will do also that kind of work. You can also explore it in ways of where if you start suspecting that there is something and then you wonder if it may have impacted you. There are books now, like there's a book called Childhood Disrupted by Donna Jackson Nakazawa, where you can start to look at other patient stories. She covers patient stories in there about how what happened emotionally in childhood unfolded into affecting somebody's behavior, affected their identity level, and affected their beliefs. And all of those things lead to either destructive health patterns. It often leads to what I call, if people have been traumatized and you're the victim, I recently heard self-love deficit disorder. I was like, oh, that's spot on. Self-love deficit disorder. So when we've been victimized in childhood and it's gone unacknowledged, unseen, unspoken about, and it's even gone in, perhaps shunted into our unconscious awareness, it causes developmental arrestment in certain areas, like developing healthy self-esteem, like developing confidence, like developing healthy boundaries. Now, when we're traumatized, we can either do the fight response and kind of become a bit of a narcissist in adulthood, or we can go in flight to response, become chronically anxious for our whole lives. A lot of us become what's called the fawning response, which means when this thing happens to us, which is essentially abandonment in childhood it was a caregiver or it was some situation that caused us to feel total lack of love and abandoned as a child, we'll do what the fawning response is. We'll people please our way back to being okay. If I'm just good enough, if I just emulate and I'm good enough and imperfect enough, I will, become, acceptable and I'll be okay. Now, all those types of responses have massive implications. Some people will, it leads to chronic overachieving, chronic under self-care. This happens hugely in the fibromyalgia chronic fatigue group, where people don't take care of themselves enough and they become chronically burnt out. They're in chronic stress. Chronic stress is going to lead to every kind of illness risk, heart disease, cancer. We know that chronic stress does that. Other ways that we can be affected, subtle ways at the identity level, can cause us to, our intentions are sabotaged, our best intentions for health are sabotaged. So, for example, a lot of people won't know that the Kaiser Permanente CDC study actually started in an obesity clinic at Kaiser Permanente.
Oh boy, yes. Obesity. Oh my gosh. Whew.
Yeah, this is it. And people, they were getting a high dropout rate. So the clinic was doing really well, but then they were getting 55% dropout rates. So it was Dr. Felici who said, well, I'm going to investigate. And he found out by mistake, by interviewing the people about why are you dropping out? And it just so happened they reported a high level of sexual abuse in childhood. And one woman summed it up when she said, the extra weight on my body is a form of protection against unwanted male attention. So this is another way. It comes in many forms. What happens to us in childhood, it affects our identity, who we become. Like the women who are losing weight were actually getting panic attacks and anxiety as the weight was coming off, because it was that healthy sort of thing we were doing with our diet was actually making us feel fundamentally threatened, that somehow we're going to bring on this catastrophe that happened to us in childhood. So how can me as a nutritionist, just when I'm dealing with obesity clients, I cannot just consider educating them on what to eat. I need to know why they do what they do. So another thing people can do to explore this is, how look back on events that happened and ask yourself and explore, did it change you? Do you notice destructive health patterns that happened after this event happened? Was there more than one event? Was anybody around that you could speak to? Because if there was, it reduces the impact of it. And there's even things like, I don't know if you're aware, Dr. Veronica, of the Enneagram personality typing system. I talk about the Enneagram a lot.
Yes.
This is a great tool. It's just a tool for self-exploration. So we found, for example, that achievers, perfectionists, helpers, and anxiety types, that's 4 of the 9 personality types in the Enneagram system, were particularly prone to all the burnout related illnesses. And I'm sure nobody's done a mass mapping yet of which Enneagram type tends to get different types of illnesses. But that exploration, like do the personality typing testing, enneagraminstitute.com, just go to that website, it's completely free, and go and start checking out, like, people haven't explored who they are, why they do things in their life, and how they're interacting with other people. And that system, I love that system, because unlike other personality systems, it's not typing people by external behavior, like what people do. It's typing by why. So why people do things. So it's who people are at their core. Yeah. And it's very spiritual system as well. So there's so much there's so many other things we could talk about as well. So the other thing, why
I'm going to say, it's just like, okay, we're getting to the end of our time, and we're going to have to do another interview.
I just realized we got
I could sit here and listen you're giving so much great information. I love about the Enneagram. And I think that people also got to understand that when we're talking about the spirit, we're not talking about a particular religion at all. This is not a religious
society. It's totally.
Everybody has a spirit. And we're talking about your aura, your spirit, there's your physical self, and then there's all these layers outside yourself that extend and touch everybody else in the whole universe, everything else in the whole universe. And so this is Einstein stuff. This is Einstein theory. This is the type of information that Einstein was working on that we don't realize exactly what it was when he was wandering around and talking about E=mc². This is the type of information that he was talking about. That was outside of what we physically see with our eyes. Well, some of us can see it. Sometimes I can see people's auras. Sometimes I can, if I look really hard, I can see things about people, which sometimes disconcerting. And so I back off from it because, going into somebody's energy that much is challenging. But Niki, just about a minute of where we can find you. I know you have a gift that people can get that can help them. So tell us about that.
Yes, it's great. I'm glad we can share this, because we could have talked for hours. So people can get tons of information on my website. I have a free report. It's like a free ebook, and it's called The 7 Steps to Healing Emotional Trauma and Building Resilience. And literally, and that free book is just, all you do is opt in. There's no cost or anything. It's completely free. You can read more about, like, for example, adversity in childhood, the mechanisms about how that turns into biology, and then literally the 7 steps to recovery. And I have at least 7 steps. We only covered one, really, which was awareness. So there are at least 5 other things that people could do. The good news is it's reversible. You could change the epigenetic expression of things that happened to you in childhood. And there's enormous amounts of help out there. What's lacking most is the awareness of just connecting things and that are happening to us emotionally, spiritually. We just don't realize that. So that is half the battle, is getting people connected back to that. Because ultimately, connecting back to your soul self, trauma causes a disconnect from the soul self. And when you don't have the inner connection to source, you feel totally abandoned, empty. That's where all the addictive behaviors come from, whether it's addiction to work, whether it's drugs, whether it's food, whether it's attention. So, or chronic relationships that always fail because we're not connected to source within. So the healing of that is connect back to source within and connect back to this, and you'll find that you will not even attract things like energy vampires, which is a whole other topic. Energy vampires are the people who are the traumatizers. So so there's tons of information on that. I encourage people to download the book.
Oh gosh, we got to talk about these energy vampires some other time. But Niki, what's your website?
It's nikigratrix.com. So that's NIKIGRATRIX.com. The book's on there. I even have a tab at the top called ACE score. So no opt-in even required. Tab at the top, ACE score. If people want to just go and do their own ACE score, what's my ACE score? It's based on the original research. People can just tot that up and start their journey. So
thank you so much. You heal that childhood trauma. You could heal for generations what's going on. So it's important for people to grasp hold of this information. Niki, thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being on the Wellness Revolution.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you for listening to the Wellness Revolution podcast. If you want to hear more on how to bring wellness into your life, visit drveronica.com. See you all next week. Take care.